development financing activities. As you know, that China has, in the last 20 years, emerged as the biggest player in development finance around the world. AidData's work has shed light on this reality, and the gap that we fill in our work has to do with raising awareness based on actual evidence and data rather than rhetoric on the true form and function of China's overseas development financing, which is loans, foreign aids, grants, and so on. But because we are a US-based institution, we talk a lot to people in this part of the world. I think it is sometimes useful for us to step back and take the time to understand the other side. China is an old civilization. They have very well-developed institutions of government. Obviously, they're the second largest economy in the world, second most populous country in the world, now that India has officially taken over. This talk and the idea of this event was really to step back from our usual day-to-day grind of trying to put the numbers together and understand these projects, thousands and thousands of these projects, to really understand how China views the world. What is the difference between the terminologies that are used in Beijing versus in Western capitals when they talk about foreign aid or development assistance, and to really dig deep into some of the implications of these terminologies. So we're very lucky that we have, I would say safe to say, is one of the leading experts on this topic, Marina Rudyak. She is an assistant professor of Chinese studies at Heidelberg University, which is a beautiful town in Germany. She's also affiliated with Göttingen University. Her areas of specialty are obviously China's international development cooperation, but she's also an expert in China-Russia relationship and China's role in Central Asia, as well as international discourse of the Chinese Communist Party. So she speaks fluent Chinese, has spent a lot of time since her undergraduate days in China. But also another interesting vantage point she brings is that she spent many years working at the German International Cooperation Agency, GIZ, in China, where she was leading Germany's engagements in China on development financing and technical cooperation. So that also gives her a very unique vantage point. She's also the co-founder of a wonderful initiative which I would encourage you all to check out. It's called Decoding China Dictionary. You will see a few snippets from that in her talk today, where she really tries to unpack, what does it mean when a Chinese leader talks about democracy or aid, and when you read their speeches, what does that actually mean and where they're coming from. So this is a resource that we've used extensively for our work and continue to want to use more and more of. With that, I'll stop and say thank you once again, Marina, for coming. She's going to talk for about 20 minutes, and then we have a full hour until 6:30. Hold your questions, and we'll have plenty of time for a Q&A after Marina finishes her talk. So thank you once again. I'm going to close the light so you can see the screen more properly. She's got some beautiful colors here. Thank you, Kira, which I would like you to see in there for me. So over to you, Marina. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much for the introduction, and thank you for the opportunity to be here with you. I've been a huge fan of the AidData project for many years and benefited from the work of the project. So it's an honor to be here to spend the week with you guys, and to have the opportunity to share some of my own research. Sorry for everybody who sits next to the thing. I'm just going to try and stand here so you don't have to move your head around. Unpacking global China, Beijing view on development, modernization, and the world. I would like to start not with China, but with us. Us meaning those of us sitting here at this geographical point in the United States at this time on 30th of March 2023. And travel a little bit back in history to the year 1990, where the Western world believed that history has ended and the Cold War has ended, the Soviet Union has collapsed, and everybody will become like us. Hi guys, come in. And this is a quote by Francis Fukuyama, which many of you are probably familiar with. What we may be witnessing is not the end of the Cold War, but the end of history as such. That is the end point of man's ideological evolution and the universalization of Western liberal democracy. Prior to that, China watchers or Soviet Union watchers scrapped through party newspapers and engaged in something which back then was called Kremlinology or Pekingology. And well, after the Soviet Union collapsed and China was moving on a liberalization path, we believed that we never have to engage with that. There was also a very strong belief that at some point China will democratize. The Chinese Communist Party is either going to fail or China will at least turn into something like a bigger version of Singapore. Well, that didn't happen. This is a cover from the New York Times from 2018, writing about China, the land that failed to fail. Everybody waited till the Chinese Communist Party will fail. This away. In the year 2023, history is very clearly back. The autocracies are stronger as ever. We have a war in where I come from, at more or less the heart of Europe, in Russia and Ukraine. And the most powerful man in the world, at least this is how the German journalist Stefan Aus and Adrian Geigesfeld called him, is Xi Jinping. Elsewhere he has been called the chairman of everything. And Xi Jinping himself has also opinion on history, and in 2016, on the 95th anniversary of the Chinese Communist Party, he said, history has not ended, nor can it possibly end. The Chinese Communist Party and the Chinese people have every confidence in their ability to provide a Chinese solution to aid the exploration of a better social system for humanity. So, this is where we are. And since Xi Jinping's coming to power as the Secretary General of the Chinese Communist Party in late 2012 and then as China's president in March 2013, we've seen a strong shift in foreign policy orientation. Since Deng Xiaoping, since 1978, even more so since Tiananmen in 1989, all Chinese leaders followed a foreign policy doctrine of hiding your talents and biding time. Under Xi, we had a very strong shift to a proactive foreign policy with a new focus on telling the China story well and bringing Chinese values and wisdom to the outside world. And here you see pages, sponsored pages by the People's Daily in international newspapers promoting the Chinese story. And what has happened is that same terms are imbued with different meanings. Key terms of international relations and development cooperation are being redefined. This includes democracy or human rights. Human rights, for example, is something what makes happy. And this is a part of an effort since 1989 to build an own international discourse system, integrating values to make them safe for the Chinese Communist Party, and since 2014 to promote a Chinese discourse. One way how it plays out, for example, is that prior to Xi Jinping, the official narrative of the Chinese government was that China is too big to be a democracy, or it is too poor to be a democracy. Since 2014, this narrative is shifted to say China is also a democracy, it's just a different one, and actually it is a better one. Last year, the Chinese government published a white paper called China a Democracy That Works, outlining how China is actually a better democracy than the United States, and internationally arguing that no country has the right to decide who is a democracy and who is not a democracy. And the objective of this redefinition of key terms is to recenter the meaning of norms and to normalize the plurality of norms that the West believed or agreed on to be universal norms. Now, why should we care? My answer is to draw inspiration of, again, I'm from Europe, but actually from two US historians, Zachary Shore and former National Security Advisor General McMaster, who is a PhD in history, who talk about strategic empathy and strategic narcissism. Strategic empathy, a concept by Shore, argues for the importance of stepping out of our own heads and understanding the ideologies, emotions, and aspirations that drive others. McMaster picked up the concept of strategic narcissism from Hans Morgenthau, who actually made the same criticism of the United States in the 1970s, and argues that strategic narcissism prevents you from seeing how the others involved have independence, individual will, and agency to act on things that have nothing to do. Now, don't confuse empathy with sympathy. Understanding how somebody else thinks does not mean you agree or have to agree. But the importance lies in understanding the worldview of somebody else. And I don't have a slide on that, but Otto Scharmer, who's an organizational development scholar from MIT, has a model of 4 levels of listening. And I'm sure some of you will be familiar with what I'm going to say. The first level of listening is I listen to you, but actually I listen to the thoughts in my head. And I'm already preparing what I'm going to respond to. Second level of listening is I'm listening to you and I notice the differences between what you're saying and what I'm thinking. Third level of listening, I'm listening to you and I'm trying to feel what makes you think the way you do. Fourth level of listening, I'm listening to you with the intention that we co-create something in the future. Now, question to you, if you think about, I mean, you are students in the United States, I would ask the same question to my students at home. If you think about your foreign policy, what is the level of listening most policymakers are operating at? Honest answers. Give me, you just, let's show me fingers. Like pretty high so I can see. Yeah. Anybody at 2? Yes. Okay. At least. Good. So there you have your answer. You know, why do we have to engage with the way how the Chinese government is part of things? Because it matters. And Ammar just said, you know, 8 data nerds. We are 5 Chinese political discourse and ideology nerds who spend our nights, because this started as a pet project, looking at how the key terms of international relations and development cooperation are understood differently in the Western discourse and in the discourse of the Chinese Communist Party. And these terms are also shifting and fluctuating. And we compiled the Decoding China dictionary, which I would really encourage everybody to go to. It's short entries. It's all based on the original Chinese discourse, because you can assume that probably only 5% of everything that is available on official documents from China is translated into English. And the official Chinese translations are part of what we call translated China, and this is actually part of external propaganda. So if we want to understand how the Chinese government thinks, we need to go back to the original sources, and we need to be trained in decoding. And those of you who are probably Chinese native speakers will agree with me that just reading Chinese doesn't help you to understand. You need to have your daily dose of of the party documents to understand what the government and the party actually. And I would like to share with you today 6 terms from the dictionary which are relevant to development. And I would like to start with democracy. Because I think this is a term that moves many here in the room. Now, in the UN, and oh, I'm sorry, actually, I haven't changed it on the slides. So on all the slides, it's going to be UN in EU context. You can replace it with the United States because it's a European project. It's the European Union there. Democracy is understood as universal and secret suffrage, possibility of transfer of power, separation of powers, rule of law, civil society, free media, and it is understood as guided by input legitimacy. So citizen participation and protection of human rights. Xi Jinping has argued in 2017 that China's socialist democracy is the broadest, most genuine, and most effective democracy. Why does the Chinese Communist Party say this? It's kind of the basic foundation is obviously the sole leadership of the party, and that the transfer of power takes place only within the party. So wouldn't work with the European context. Also, legislation and state organs are all under the leadership of the Chinese Communist parties, but citizens can vote in some areas. There is centralized decision-making, but, and this is how the CCP explains China being a democracy, there is broad participation through consultations. So laws and legal documents are posted online for comments, and there's a chat, there's a phone number, there's an email. You can comment as a citizen you can call, and there is actually somebody on the end of the line who reads that. In contrast to the Western input legitimacy, there is an output legitimacy, ensuring prosperity, order, and security for the citizens. In the domestic discourse, China is explained as a democratic leadership led by the Chinese Communist Party, Party Congress, and government organs. The party gathers feedback through consultative democracy, amongst others through the People's Consultative Conference, where the 8 democratic parties are organized, but the Communist Party has the final decision power. Do you want to take this chair? So the party itself is built on the principle of democratic centralism, collective discussion, but central collective decision. This is not uncontroversial. Within the party, there have been demands for liberalization. There have been independent candidates for the People's Congresses, but it has disappeared under Xi Jinping, and the centralization of control within the party has increased even more now with the last National People's Congress. In the international context, we've seen a shift. Hong Kong, after return in 1997, was portrayed as a democracy in Hong Kong was portrayed as a way of life of Hong Kong, and something Hong Kong special. This has shifted to public danger and poison. Public danger because Hong Kong-style democracy endangers the legitimate interests of the people, which is stability. And mainland democratic system was portrayed as superior, so Hong Kong delegates must be patriotic and support the party policies. Internationally, we've seen demands for democratization of international relations, meaning the subtext that it is dominated by the United States and the West, a critique you would raise very legitimately, by the way, and at the same time, with a strong state orientation and exclusion of non-state actors. And the demands for plurality equal to demands for an equivalence of different concepts and systems of democracy, namely recognizing that China too is a democracy, Russia too is a democracy. Everybody who declares themselves to be a democracy can be a democracy. Now, after that, let's move on to modernization, which is a very important term at the moment because it is dominating the new leadership era of Xi Jinping. He's spoken on that at the last party meetings, and I would show you a quote from the People's Daily from April 2021, which says our modernization has features common to the modernization of all countries, but also has unique Chinese characteristics based on national conditions, a Chinese-style modernization. The modernization we want to achieve is a modernization with a huge population, a modernization with common prosperity for all people, a modernization with the coordination of material and spiritual civilization, a modernization with the harmonious coexistence of man and nature, and a modernization on the road of peaceful development. Sounds nice, but if you trace this back to Deng Xiaoping and the expectation that China will modernize already in 1979, Deng Xiaoping, when he spoke on the four modernizations in industry, agriculture, army and science and technology China wants to pursue, he stressed that the four modernizations we want to realize are four Chinese-style modernizations. Our concept of the four modernization is not a concept of modernization as yours is, meaning that China will not follow a path of democracy, because at the same time there was a call for the fifth modernization with the democracy wall movement in Beijing, and this is the response. So yes, four modernizations, but not the fourth modernization, fifth modernization, not democracy. Now, in the Western context, modernization is understood as a process of development from pre-modern to traditional or to a modern society, associated not only with technological advancement, but also with secularization, democratization, and advancement of human rights. And it's linked to the ideas of enlightenment and rationality. In the Chinese discourse, there is a very long history for China that modernization does not have to equal and should not equal westernization. Since the late 19th, early 20th century, after the Opium Wars, when Chinese intellectuals were looking at how can China modernize, how can China overcome its backwardness, which led to the Opium Wars, which led to it being forced to open up by Western powers to seize parts of the country as colonies or semi-colonies, the answer always was Chinese substance, Western application. To take from the West which is useful, but keep the Chinese substance, and that which was then followed by Mao's socialist modernization, which meant modernization of industry, agriculture, army, and science and technology, but no political liberalization or democracy. And now, a few weeks ago, in February 23, Xi Jinping spoke that Chinese-style modernization has broken with the myth that modernization has to equal westernization. It has shown an alternative modernization path for developing countries, and it offers as a Chinese solution to humanity's search for a better social system. So the reason why I'm talking this historical patterns is just to show you that these ideas are nothing new. But actually you can trace that back to the late 19th, early 20th century, and as I will show you further on, ideas on development and ideas of how developing countries should develop, and that China's path is linked to other developing countries is also something that has been present since the early days of the People's Republic of China, but actually even earlier. So let's talk about development and related to that, aid. In the Western discourse, development is understood as a multidimensional social economic process with political, economic, social, and environmental and cultural dimensions. And the political dimension is understood as essential for realization of all the other dimensions. This is why we talk good governance. This is why we talk human rights. Now, in the Chinese official discourse, development is understood as a process of technology-centered modernization. And economic development, transport infrastructure, energy, digital infrastructure, manufacturing, technological innovation is seen as something that leads to social progress, which is the basis for improving of people's livelihood, and which is also the basis of green development. This is, by the way, why the Chinese government rejects good governance as aid conditionality, because it argues this is not the point. The basis is infrastructure development. At the same time, the Chinese leadership has framed development for a long time, and more recently much stronger, as the highest human right. the right to development. There is a white paper called Right to Development, and in the Global Development Initiative that the Chinese government has presented in the United Nations in 2021, development is also framed as the highest human right. Now, development requires social stability, which is linked, which is spelled out in the Global Security Initiative that was presented a few weeks ago. Social stability means the absence of dissent. So if you really think this true, then you can explain every suppression of protests, including Hong Kong, including the Xinjiang policy, as a protection of human rights. Now, aid, again, in the OECD DAC context, is understood as a transfer of resources from rich donor to poorer developing countries with the aim of promoting social and economic development. And there is a common view that aid should be charitable, or at least with a gift element. Now, critical development scholars have criticized this using Ammar's gift theory, which I personally find very plausible, and this, I think, explains why China has been so successful on mobilizing allies and friends through aid, but this would be a separate topic. In the Chinese official discourse, aid China gives is understood as South-South cooperation, aid between poor countries, and it is framed in terms of equality, friendship, and mutual benefit. Again, nothing new, but something you can trace back not only to the early years of the PRC, you can actually trace it back to Sun Yat-sen, who in 1920 presented to the League of Nations, the UN's predecessor, a plan for the development of China, where he offered to the League of Nations to provide finances for China's infrastructure development in exchange for access to Chinese resources, what China from the mid-2000s has then been doing in Africa, by the way, on the basis of equality and mutual. So the idea of mutual benefit has been ingrained in the way how China thinks about aid for a very, very, very long time. Now, in more modern times, reciprocity can be either direct in goods and services, like concessional loans and exchange taxes for resources, or it can be indirect in terms of political support, where many people use aid data to show that there is a strong correlation between aid giving, slightly less strong correlation between investment and trade, and voting with China in the United Nations on issues that are important to China, like human rights or Taiwan. And now, also interestingly, just if we talk about wording, almost everything in the range you immediately have it can be termed as help and aid. And one beautiful example of that is when, in the early days of COVID, I think in March, China sent masks to Italy. And the Five Star Movement, the political party in Italy, presented that this is help from China. And actually on the Chinese, the Ministry of Foreign Affairs website, it was also framed as aid. Now, journalists started looking into it and said, well, actually, this was a commercial transaction. China sold masks to Italy, so why is it aid? And then Wang Yi, China's foreign minister, explained, but we helped you, you needed masks, we had masks. So this is an example where you see that there is no bad intent, it's just a different use of the word aid. And those of you who speak Chinese know that probably very well. That it's just, sometimes you have same terms and you understand different things. This reciprocity is something that is being played up and up and up in the Chinese official discourse, especially towards Africa. This is from Xi Jinping's speech at the Forum of China-Africa Cooperation in 2021, which is a phrase that is repeated by Chinese heads of state and foreign ministers and ambassadors. I would like to express my heartfelt gratitude to the vast number of African friends who supported China in restoring its rightful seat in the United Nations. And just before China was voted into the United Nations in 1971 to replace Taiwan, Chinese aid spiked like hugely, with China providing 2% of its GDP as foreign aid. OECD target for developed countries today is 0.7%, usually 5 to 7 countries reach it. Now let's move on to multilateralism and cooperation. Multilateralism is I think one of my favorite terms in this thing. Again, one of the statements we hear very often, especially from Xi Jinping himself, is China has always supported multilateralism, practiced multilateralism, and worked with other countries around the world to pursue development in the spirit of openness, cooperation, and mutual benefit. Now, at the same time, you have other statements by more explicitly hawkish voices in the Chinese leadership, like Wang Yi, formerly foreign minister, now head of the foreign. Now, let me play you a short video.
The speech of President Xi Jinping was historical. 4 years after he made a famous speech in Davos in 2017, where he emphasized the need for the world to embrace multilateralism, he came back to this proposal and notion of multilateralism at a very crucial time in the history of humankind.
So what we see, and this was the reason behind the dictionary, is that stakeholders in the West would repeat the wording without being aware of what's behind the wording. And understandably, I mean, if you read to the statement by Xi in the call with the UN Secretary General in May 2021, the world needs genuine multilateralism, and all countries should act in accordance with the purpose and principles of the UN Charter, refrain from pursuing multilateralism and hegemonism, and should not use multilateralism as a pretext to form small circles or stir up ideological confrontation. In part, you know, in some points you could agree, but then what is actually genuine multilateralism and what is a fake multilateralism? And if you start digging into the Chinese documents, you see a very strong criticism of the multilateral system, which argues that the existing multilateral system is not fair and just, but safeguards narrow interests of a small group. And that international affairs should be handled by all countries through consultation in accordance with rules agreed by all countries. The Belt and Road Initiative was presented as an alternative multilateralism with Chinese characteristics. The unity of a shared future for mankind, dialogue without confrontation, partnership without alliance. But in practice, joint consultation means bilateral agreements instead of universal binding rules. You could explain it as a multi-bilateralism. And one example where it has played out, which relates to development, is the common framework, debt relief initiative after COVID, where China has agreed to participate in the G20 debt relief, but then you read the press release of the Chinese Ministry of Finance, and it states, we welcome the G20 initiative, we endorse it, we are going to support it, and we are going to negotiate bilaterally with all the involved countries. Cooperation is, I think, probably the most misunderstood term in relations with China. Cooperation, first and foremost, means win-win cooperation. And in Xi Jinping's thought of diplomacy, we read about building a new type of international relations featuring win-win cooperation. So if you see somebody talking about a new type, obviously there's an old type that is not working, and this win-win cooperation is presented as an alternative to the prevailing old type of Western-dominated international relations, which Chinese diplomats accuse of Cold War mentality and confrontational zero-sum game thinking. In the idea of win-win cooperation, there is an embedded connotation of relationality and reciprocity. Cooperation is understood as a path to uncover shared interests and build friendly relations. It is based on the principle of seeking common ground while maintaining differences. If you take this seriously, it means that cooperation is always possible. So you cooperate not because you have common interests and you want to achieve a common target. You cooperate to establish a relationship and to find common interests, because once the relationship is there, everything can be solved. And one thing where we see it playing out is summit diplomacy, which plays a very big role in Chinese foreign policy. Think of the Forum of China-Africa Cooperation, think of the Belt and Road Forum. Summit diplomacy is for building relational power, and relational power is the power of human relations. So if you look at texts by Chinese IR scholars, it always comes down to relationality and interpersonal relations, which, if we are honest, is the same. Here it's just that, and maybe IR scholars among you are going to kill me, that this is something we are trying to rationalize way in IR scholarship, unless you do political psychology. An underlying expectation is also that gifts will be reciprocated. And there is a wonderful quote by Deng Xiaoping from 1978, where Mao died, they came to power, China was among the 20 poorest countries in the world, and the leadership discussed, should we continue giving aid? I think 2% of GDP, very expensive. And then decided that China's international status is linked to aid giving. So no matter whether we are poor or rich, we need to continue giving aid in order to create an international environment favorable to China's development. Because if we supported others, they supported us in return. So the expectation is if we continue to support, there will be support in return. Which, if you think critical development scholarship and charitable aid giving, this opportunity to re-establish symbolic reciprocity has been cut away. So if you are a recipient country of Western aid, there is no opportunity for you to become equal. With China, even if there is real asymmetry, symbolically you become equal through reciprocity. And the internal discourse to that is that building shared interests through reciprocity is key to removing the obstacles of China's peaceful development in the world. And with that, I end. Check out the Decoding China dictionary, and if you want to follow me on Twitter, thank you.
I think it would be best if I held my questions back, and if you all have any questions, comments, reactions, please raise your hand and we'll take it from there. Sailor, please go ahead.
Hi, Dr. Rudyak. 欢迎来到 William Mary. My name is Sailor Miao. I'm a junior at college. I study government, and I'm also working at AidData. I'm a research assistant. My question is regarding to kind of what you're studying at, which is kind of the Chinese official jargons. So there's a term that has been said by Xi Jinping and other leaders a lot, that is 百年未有大变局, which means in English, great changes on scene in a century. And he just restated that sentence when he met with Vladimir Putin a few days ago. Before he left for his hotel, he said, "Hey, Vlad, my best friend, we're witnessing something that we haven't seen in a century." And it's really difficult for people to understand what that really means, because if you take that literally, like minus 100 years, you have the Opium War, you have the Japanese invasion of China, then you compare it to now, you would wonder, like, is he being serious? I would say China today, with the international order today, is much better than 100 years ago, despite the invasion of Ukraine. So how would you understand this sentence that has been said many, many times?
Should I reply to that, or should we collect?
If people have any other questions, I would rather collect, but if not, yes, please go ahead.
Yeah, hi. Thank you so much for your talk. I'm a professor here at William & Mary in the Chinese Studies program, and it's great to see you. So you mentioned scholars who are engaged in critical IR, who are critical of the current international relations system and U.S. domination, et cetera. So I'm wondering, do you see any ways in which China's official position not only intersects with the discourse of critical IR theorists, but could actually achieve some of the solutions that they envision? Is there any overlap?
Okay. First of all, great to see me so much alphabetic alone, right? On the official jargon, so the wording changes unseen in a century in a slightly milder version emerged after 2008, after the global financial crisis. So it predates. But you are absolutely right, and this is a criticism that has been raised by many, that there's been other stuff going on in the past 100 years. Now, it's clearly reference to the international environment that has become more difficult for China. So, and that being external shocks, like the financial crisis and COVID, but also very clearly the trade war, the more tense situation on Taiwan, and if you use this kind of wording, you can explain certain policies better to your people at home. And China is in an economic crisis at the moment. I mean, we've not only because of COVID, we've seen a lot. I mean, the white paper movement has shown the dissatisfaction among the younger population more than everything else, but it has been there before, also with the Lie Flat movement. And I mean, if we know something from Chinese history, and I don't know if it is on Xi Jinping's mind or not, we know that whenever major shifts happened, it was when the young people were not happy with the situation. This is the May 4th movement, this is 1989, it's 1978, you know, the democracy war movement. So the soup you have now is not unsimilar. And if you talk about great changes unseen in a century, you justify policies to stabilize. And stability, rights, you know. Now, on the meeting with Putin, actually, this, for those of us who follow it, we're wondering, why is Ukraine mentioned only at the very end of the press release and only with WhatsApp? We could have many explanations for that, but the most plausible to me is that Xi came with an agenda and was not successful. That he came with some kind of an offer to facilitate whatever, maybe in a similar way, like between Saudi Arabia and Iran, and nothing happened. And this was kind of, you know, we say something for face-saving reasons. Another question is, was he warned about Russia's plan to station nuclear weapons in Belarus? Most likely not. And if you think now, so Zelensky tried to establish a call, was not successful. President Biden tried to establish a call, was not successful. So most, it is possible, this could be related to Tsai Ing-wen's visit in China. It could also be relating then with the Chinese government figuring out what to do now. Because in a way, it's possible that Xi got played by Putin in the same way that, you know, everybody else in Europe got played by Putin. I don't know. So on the critical IR theory question, last semester I taught a course on Chinese IR theories for political scientists who did not have any China exposure before that. And we talked exactly about that. And what they came up with, which I would probably agree, is that the analysis of Chinese IR scores is a correct one. The question is, what are the solutions? And I mean, all of us who do critical scholarship agree that there is a need to recenter IR theory, and the whole human component we find in Chinese IR scholarship is an extremely valid and relevant one. But then, you know, what is Tianxia as a solution? Maybe not. We could discuss that. The whole, you know, incorporating chain, and I mean, for those of you in the room who are not familiar with it, there is also a lot of critique on Chinese IR scholarship, saying that it's just to explain China's rise and to legitimize the behavior of the Chinese Communist Party. And maybe yes, but the analysis part is, I would say, still valid.
Thank you. I know we had a hand there. If you have other questions, please keep it. Yes, please go ahead. We'll take
My name is Bailey Nicholson. I'm a freshman here. I do international research work under Professor Marcus Holmes here. And my question basically concerns talking about this gift of aid in the Chinese context, and specifically this meeting with Putin. What situations could you see China possibly getting involved or sending some sort of aid that they would receive something back from Russia? And what would Russia have to give China for them to receive this? Because obviously,
Military aid or general?
Both. And obviously, we live in a world that Russia invaded Ukraine last year, and that by a lot of accounts isn't going very well. And Russia, by some scholars' estimates, might want to roll the dice. What would you see them needing to give up for China?
Great, thank you.
Hi, I'm Xiwen. I'm majoring in Chinese Studies. I'm a senior. So I just want to know, like, for the modernization part, I kind of feel like in the Chinese academia, though I'm not so familiar with, but I have a feeling that the scholars will be more focused on Chinese role as like 后进国家, like a country that started develop like late. Yeah, and how like this role could be studied for could be like representation for other developing countries to learn, like in modernization or in like developing. And I think I want to know, like, what's your perspective like on this, and also do you think that's also could be applied in the like diplomacy or the international relations? Yeah, thank you.
I can take one more question in this round. If anybody has any other burning questions, yes, please go ahead.
Hi, I'm a senior studying European Studies and French. This is a little out of my wheelhouse, so I'm very grateful to be here. Thank you. My question's about the discourse we had yesterday from the spokesperson for the Chinese office on Taiwan that sort of made a threat in vague terms if the Taiwanese president met with Kevin McCarthy at the end of her visit. I think in the US press, there was sort of the alarmist China threatens Taiwanese president. How should we interpret the spokeswoman's words? That, I mean, translated in English, were threatening. Should we perceive them as that?
So thank you very much for the questions. I'll start with China and Russia. Economically, China is already both benefiting from the war and it is helping Russia. I mean, as far as we can see, China is sticking to the sanctions. So there is no direct military cooperation, though we don't know. But China is benefiting economically because it gets cheaper oil and gas, and Chinese exports are substituting everything that used to be European or American and is not going to Russia anymore because of sanctions. I think that for the moment it is in China's interest that Putin stays in power. And this is how I read his statement that there will be elections in Russia soon. I'm sure Russian people will support Putin because Putin hasn't announced anything yet in terms of running for elections. And why is that? Because, and this is what I'm saying, but so obviously Chinese diplomats didn't believe that Putin will attack Ukraine because it's just too crazy. And they kind of underestimated his craziness. Again, not my words. But the question is, what happens if Putin falls? A liberal Russia is not in Chinese interest, for obvious reasons. The people who are in line to succeed Putin, among the visible ones, are people like Ramzan Kadyrov and Prigozhin, the head of the Wagner troop, which are really mafia people. So if you think that for China stability is the most important thing, this is also not a good prospect. So things being as they are now, Putin is probably the best possible thing from the Chinese perspective, and the status quo with Ukraine as it is the best thing. Now, you could argue, why doesn't Putin distance himself from Russia? Because for now, I mean, China thinks in united front things, and the main opponent, the main actor is the United States. Will the US policy towards China change if China changes its position on Russia? Most likely not. Because for the United States, China is a rival because of its technological and economic development. So China will not gain anything by distancing itself from Russia. It will not gain anything in the global south, because for the global south, this is a European war and a European mess. European should keep Then on the second question on China's status and what can others learn from China. So for China itself, how China frames its status is that China is a developing country and a big power, a major power, a great power, depending on how you translate that word, which literally translates as big country. And with that, it presents itself, and has been doing it for a long time, as the voice of developing countries. Now it's going to be interesting to see if it's going to get contested by India, because India now has a bigger population. So China is not the biggest developing country anymore. China's aid policy has been, to a large extent, an externalization of China's domestic development policy. Very similar to what China has done in Western regions, and if you look at the wording, which is when I do mostly discourse analysis, the discourse for the development of China's West and the discourse on China's international development cooperation is very similar in wording. So Chinese policymakers believe that China's development model can be exported elsewhere. And we just had a conversation over coffee that it doesn't necessarily work this way. So in Pakistan, Pakistani policymakers believe that if we build roads, economic development will come, because obviously China says it has worked in China, and it did work in China in a certain way, because in the 1980s, Japan financed infrastructure development in China in exchange for access to resources, and this promoted both China's development industrialization and the internationalization of Japanese companies. Problem is, you can't obviously just replicate the model. And this is something I think China's policymakers are just learning. Because one of the first things in terms of development cooperation that has been established under Xi Jinping was the Center for Knowledge on International Development, the think tank under the Development Research Council, which is a think tank under the State Council. And the purpose of CIPD is to promote China's knowledge on development. And there is enough, there's a lot to share, but then the problem is, how do you translate it to local conditions? And this is something where you could argue in a way China is now experiencing a hard landing, and is starting with a learning process that, say, the West, with development assistance having a completely different background with colonial history and whatnot, but being now needing to learn because it gets expensive in terms of money and reputation. Now on the Taiwan issue, I mean the response, that the hard response from the spokesperson of Ministry of Foreign Affairs was to be expected. The question is, and this is now like we're really in a very sensitive area, where is the red line? And the Chinese government has frequently communicated that Taiwan is a core interest issue. There are red lines, we don't know exactly where they are. And the danger is that you get into a security dilemma where something happens nobody really wants. And I don't know whether it's part of the discourse here, but in Europe, there is a lot of comparison to the World War I situation, which kind of had a similar setup. You could argue that this would require something which is an original US strength, and this is diplomacy. And you could make the argument that probably we are not seeing as much diplomacy as we would.
Great. Well, thank you. We have time probably for a couple more questions, so yes.
Actually, this was a sort of a follow-up to what you just mentioned on sort of European perceptions of China and China's discourse. I'd be very interested to know, just sort of from your analysis, whether it's of German or European Union sort of foreign policy or trade policy, the degree to which they're sort of recognizing the difference between sort of the more Western understanding of China's of China versus sort of the more nuanced, what you're trying to sort of inform the academic community, policymaker community of. And then if that translates at all into different forms of policymaking within European governments.
If nobody else has a question, Marina, I'm going to add a question. We've talked a lot about China, the United States, and the West. I want to bring into picture the global South, because a lot of this China-US global influence rivalry is playing out in Africa, Latin America, and South